Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we turn towards something closer, not distant, not ancient, but something you carry with you in every moment. The human mind, it thinks, remembers, imagines. It builds entire worlds from fragments of experience, and yet much of what it does happens quietly below the surface of awareness. Even now, as you listen, your mind is doing more than you can directly observe, processing, filtering, predicting without effort. The brain receives an immense amount of information at every moment. Light enters the eyes, sound enters the ears, signals move through the body, but only a small portion reaches conscious awareness. The rest is handled automatically, selected, organized, and often discarded before it is ever noticed. This means what you experience is not everything that is happening. It is a filtered version, a simplified model designed for efficiency. The mind reduces complexity, so that action becomes possible. Without this filtering, the volume of information would be overwhelming. Instead, attention selects what matters most, based on context and past experience. This selection happens quickly, often within fractions of a second, before conscious thought has time to respond, which is why many decisions feel immediate, not because they are simple, but because the processing occurred before awareness caught up. Memory works in a similar way. It does not store experience as a complete recording. It stores fragments, pieces of sensory detail, emotional tone, meaning. And when a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed, not replayed. This reconstruction can change over time. Details shift, context updates, meaning evolves, and yet the memory still feels familiar because the mind prioritizes coherence over precision. It prefers a consistent story, even if some details are altered. This allows identity to remain stable even as experiences change. The mind also predicts constantly based on past patterns. It anticipates what will happen next. In perception, this prediction shapes what is seen. The brain does not wait for complete information. It fills in gaps based on expectation. This is why you can recognize objects quickly, even when they are partially hidden, or understand speech, even in noisy environments. The mind is not passively receiving reality. It is actively constructing it, and sometimes these constructions become visible. Optical illusions reveal the assumptions built into perception. The same image can be interpreted in multiple ways, not because the image changes, but because the mind does. Attention shifts, and a new interpretation appears. This demonstrates that perception is flexible, not fixed. The same flexibility applies to thought. Thoughts often feel controlled, but many arise automatically. Ideas appear without being intentionally created. Associations form based on memory and pattern, and attention follows them from one idea to the next. This creates the flow of thinking, a sequence that feels continuous but is built from separate events, each thought arising, changing, and passing, often replaced before it is fully examined. Despite this constant movement, there is a sense of stability, a feeling that I am the one thinking, but the source of thought is not always clear, because thoughts can appear without deliberate intention. This raises a subtle question. If thoughts arise on their own, then what role does control play? The answer is not simple. Some aspects of thought can be directed. Attention can be focused. Decisions can be made. But much of the underlying process remains automatic, operating beneath awareness. This balance between control and automatic function allows the mind to be efficient, handling complexity without requiring constant effort. And yet, it also means that much of what shapes experience is not directly observed. It happens quietly, in the background, guiding perception, influencing thought, shaping memory before awareness even notices. And as this continues, the mind maintains a sense of continuity, linking one moment to the next through memory and expectation, creating the feeling of a stable experience, even as everything within it is constantly changing. This is the foundation, a system that filters, constructs, predicts, and remembers all at once. And this is only the beginning, because beyond these processes, there are deeper patterns, less visible, but just as influential, patterns that shape emotion, decision-making, and the sense of self. And as we continue, those patterns begin to emerge slowly and in detail, one layer at a time. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. Each neuron forms connections with thousands of others, creating a network with trillions of synaptic links. These connections are not fixed. They change continuously in response to experience. This process is known as neuroplasticity. When certain patterns of activity repeat, connections between neurons strengthen. When patterns are not used, connections weaken. This allows the brain to adapt to new information, new environments, and new behaviors. Learning is not stored in a single location. It is distributed across networks, motor skills, language, memory. Each involves coordinated activity between multiple regions. For example, the hippocampus plays a key role in forming new memories. It helps convert short-term experience into longer-term storage. But over time, memories are reorganized. They become less dependent on the hippocampus and more integrated across the cortex. This process is gradual. It can take hours, days, or longer. Sleep plays a critical role here. During certain stages of sleep, patterns of neural activity are replayed. This replay strengthens connections and stabilizes memory, which is why information learned before sleep is often remembered more clearly. The brain is also highly efficient in how it uses energy. Although it represents only about 2% of body weight, it consumes around 20% of total energy. Despite this high demand, it operates under constraints. Energy must be allocated carefully, which is one reason the brain relies on prediction. Instead of processing every detail from the environment, it generates expectations about what is likely to occur. Incoming information is compared against these predictions. Only differences require significant processing. This reduces workload and increases speed, but it also introduces bias because perception becomes influenced by prior experience. This predictive process is continuous. It shapes what is noticed, what is ignored, how information is interpreted. In some cases, it can lead to errors. The brain may see something that is not present because it fits the prediction, or fail to notice something that does not. This is not a malfunction. It is a trade-off. Speed and efficiency over perfect accuracy. Emotion also plays a central role in how the mind operates. The amygdala processes emotional significance. It responds quickly, especially to potential threats, often before conscious awareness. This allows rapid reactions, but can also influence perception. Neutral events may be interpreted as significant based on emotional state. Memory is affected as well. Emotionally charged experiences are more likely to be remembered because they trigger stronger neural activity during encoding. But this does not guarantee accuracy. High emotional intensity can distort detail, focusing attention on certain aspects while neglecting others. Decision-making is also influenced by systems outside conscious awareness. The brain uses heuristics, mental shortcuts, to simplify complex choices. These shortcuts are efficient, but not always precise. They can introduce systematic biases. For example, the availability heuristic leads people to estimate likelihood based on how easily examples come to mind. Events that are vivid or recent may seem more common than they are. Another pattern is confirmation bias, the tendency to favor information that supports existing beliefs and to overlook information that contradicts them. These patterns operate automatically. They do not require deliberate thought, and they shape perception without being directly noticed. The sense of control over thoughts and actions is also more limited than it appears. Experiments have shown that neural activity associated with a decision can be detected before the person becomes aware of choosing. This suggests that some decisions are initiated unconsciously before awareness registers them. Conscious thought may then interpret or justify what has already begun. This does not eliminate agency, but it complicates it because the boundary between voluntary and automatic processes is not always clear. Language plays a unique role in shaping thought. It allows abstraction, concepts that are not tied to immediate experience, time, possibility, identity. These can be represented symbolically, but language also constrains thought. The structure of language influences how ideas are formed. Different languages emphasize different distinctions, which can affect perception and categorization, even internally. Thought often takes the form of language, a running dialogue that organizes experience, but not all thought is verbal. Much of it is visual or associative, patterns of imagery, emotion, and memory, interacting without words. Attention continues to regulate which of these processes becomes conscious. Only a limited number of elements can be held in focus at once. This limit is often described as working memory capacity. Typically, only a small number of items can be actively maintained, which is why complex tasks require sequencing, breaking information into manageable parts. The brain also continuously monitors the body, signals from internal systems are integrated into awareness. This includes heart rate, breathing, internal sensation. This process is known as the interoception. it contributes to emotional experience because changes in the body are interpreted as feelings. A shift in heart rate may be experienced as anxiety or excitement, depending on context. This demonstrates that emotion is not separate from physical state. It is closely linked. The mind is not a single system. It is a coordination of multiple systems, each with its own function, perception, memory, emotion, decision-making, all interacting continuously and often without direct awareness. This complexity allows flexibility, but it also means that experience is constructed from many sources, not all of which are visible. And as these systems interact, they create patterns of thought, patterns of behavior, patterns of response, some stable, some changing. These patterns shape identity, influence perception, guide action, and yet they remain dynamic, adjusted over time through experience, through repetition, through attention, which means the mind is not fixed. It is continuously forming and reforming, adapting to what it encounters, often without being noticed. And as these processes continue, they give rise to something larger, a sense of coherence, a feeling that everything is connected, organized, meaningful, even when the underlying systems are complex. And this sense of coherence becomes the foundation for how reality is experienced, not as separate processes, but as a unified whole. And yet, that unity is constructed, maintained by systems that are constantly in motion, which leads to the next layer, not just how the mind processes information, but how it creates meaning and how that meaning shapes everything that is experienced. The human mind does not only process information, it assigns meaning. Every perception, every memory, every event is interpreted, not simply received. This interpretation happens rapidly, often before conscious awareness. The brain evaluates input based on prior knowledge. Patterns are matched, context is applied, and from this, meaning is generated. This process allows efficient interaction with the world. Without it, every moment would require full analysis, which would be too slow for real-time decision-making. Instead, the mind uses existing frameworks. These frameworks are built over time, from experience, from learning, from repeated exposure. They form what are often called belief systems. Beliefs are not always explicit. Many operate below conscious awareness. They shape interpretation without being directly noticed. For example, two individuals can experience the same event and interpret it differently. One may see opportunity, another may see risk. The sensory input is the same, but the meaning assigned is different. This difference arises from internal models, models that predict what events mean, what outcomes are likely, what responses are appropriate. These models are not static. They are updated continuously, but they are also resistant to change because stability allows faster processing. If beliefs changed constantly, prediction would become unreliable. So, the brain balances flexibility with consistency, allowing adaptation without losing coherence. This balancing process leads to certain patterns. One of the most studied is confirmation bias. Information that aligns with existing beliefs is more easily accepted. Information that conflicts requires more processing and is more likely to be dismissed. This is not deliberate. It is a property of how the system maintains stability. Another pattern is cognitive dissonance, when new information contradicts existing beliefs. There is a tension. The mind attempts to resolve this tension by adjusting interpretation, sometimes by reinterpreting the new information, sometimes by modifying the belief, but often by preserving the existing model and minimizing the contradiction. This preserves coherence, but it can reduce accuracy. Meaning making also relies heavily on pattern recognition. The brain is highly sensitive to patterns It detects regularities in environment, in behavior, in sequences of events. This ability allows prediction, but it can also lead to pattern over detection, seeing connections where none exist. This is known as apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful relationships in random data. This tendency is not entirely disadvantageous. It reflects a bias toward detection. It is often safer to assume a pattern exists than to miss one that matters, which again reflects a trade-off: sensitivity over precision. Narrative plays a central role in organizing meaning. The mind constructs stories, not necessarily with words, but with structure. Events are linked, causes are assigned, outcomes are interpreted. This creates a sense of order, a way to understand what has happened and what may happen next. Narratives are not limited to external events. They also apply to the self. Identity is maintained through an ongoing narrative, a story that connects past experiences, present state, future expectations. This narrative is continuously updated. New experiences are integrated. Old experiences are reinterpreted. The story evolves, but it maintains coherence, because coherence supports decision making. Without a stable narrative, action becomes difficult. There would be no consistent reference point, no sense of continuity. This narrative function relies on multiple brain regions. The default mode network is particularly involved. It becomes active when attention is not focused on external tasks. During reflection, memory, recall, imagining the future. This network supports self-referential thinking, the ability to think about oneself across time. It connects past experiences with future projections, allowing planning, but also contributing to rumination. Repetitive thought, often focused on personal narrative. This demonstrates that the same systems can support both adaptation and distress, depending on how they are used. Meaning is also influenced by emotional state. Emotion prioritizes certain interpretations. A neutral event may be interpreted differently depending on mood. In a positive state, ambiguity may be seen as opportunity. In a negative state, the same ambiguity may be seen as threat. This is because emotion modulates attention and influences which aspects of experience are emphasized. Memory interacts with this process. Events that align with emotional state are more easily recalled. This creates reinforcement. A pattern of thought becomes more likely when it is supported by memory. Over time, these patterns can stabilize, forming consistent interpretations, which can become beliefs. Beliefs influence perception. Perception influences memory. Memory reinforces belief. This creates a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing system, which can be adaptive or limiting, depending on the content. The mind also seeks causality. It prefers explanations. Events are rarely left unconnected. Causes are assigned, even when they are uncertain. This allows prediction, but can also lead to oversimplification. Complex systems are reduced to simple explanations, which are easier to process, but may not capture full detail. Language amplifies this effect. It allows abstract concepts to be formed and communicated, but it also simplifies complex experiences are translated into words which are inherently limited. This translation can distort. Certain aspects are emphasized, others are omitted, which shapes how experience is remembered and how it is shared. Over time, language-based narratives can become dominant, influencing how events are interpreted before they are even experienced. Because expectation precedes perception, the brain predicts what is likely to occur and prepares accordingly. This prediction shapes attention, interpretation, response, which means meaning is not assigned after perception. It is integrated into perception itself. This integration is efficient, but it reduces neutrality. Experience is rarely raw. It is filtered through layers of interpretation. These layers are not easily removed. because they operate automatically and continuously. Even when attention is directed inward, narrative can continue. Thoughts organize experience. Interpretation persists. Meaning is generated, often without deliberate effort. This makes it difficult to observe experience without interpretation, but not impossible when attention stabilizes and observation becomes more direct. It becomes possible to notice the construction process, to see how meaning is assigned, how beliefs shape perception, how narratives form, not as abstract concepts, but as ongoing activity. This observation changes the relationship to thought. Instead of identifying with narrative, it becomes possible to see it as something that is occurring, not something that defines, but something that is generated. And as this becomes clearer, another question emerges. If meaning is constructed, if belief shapes perception, if narrative organizes identity, then what is experience? Before interpretation, what is perception? Before meaning is applied, and what remains when narrative is quiet? These questions do not eliminate meaning. They place it in context as one layer within a larger system, a system that includes perception, memory, attention, emotion, and something more fundamental, something that is present. Before meaning is assigned, before belief is applied, before narrative begins, and that becomes the next point of focus. Not the structure of meaning, but what exists when meaning is not being actively constructed. Before a thought is formed, before a word appears, before an object is recognized, there is sensation. Light reaches the eyes. Vibrations reach the ears. Signals move through the body. At this stage, there is no label, no identification, no interpretation, only raw input. But this stage is extremely brief because the brain begins processing immediately, within milliseconds. Signals are transformed, edges are detected, contrast is enhanced, motion is tracked. In the visual system, specialized cells respond to specific features. Some detect orientation, others detect movement, others respond to color. These features are processed in parallel, not sequentially, which allows rapid construction of a visual scene. But at this point, there is still no object, only structured information, edges, shapes, gradients. The brain then begins grouping. This process is guided by principles: similarity, proximity, continuity. Elements that are close together are grouped. Elements that move together are grouped. Elements that share features are grouped. From this grouping, objects begin to emerge, not because they exist as separate units in the input, but because the brain organizes them that way. This is known as perceptual organization. It allows the environment to be interpreted efficiently, but it is not a direct copy of reality. It is a constructed representation. Once objects are formed, they are matched to memory. Stored patterns are compared to current input. If a match is found, recognition occurs. The object is identified. A name may be assigned. A category is activated, and meaning begins to form. All of this happens within a fraction of a second, so quickly that it feels immediate, as if perception and recognition are the same process, but they are not. There is a sequence: sensation, organization, recognition, interpretation, each stage building on the previous one, and each stage altering the final experience. This sequence is not limited to vision. In hearing, sound waves are decomposed into frequencies. Patterns are detected. Rhythm is identified, and meaning is assigned. Speech is recognized, not as raw sound, but as structured language. Even when parts are missing, the brain fills in gaps, predicting what should be there. In touch, pressure and temperature signals are mapped to the body, but the body itself is also a model constructed from sensory input, which means even the sense of physical location is interpreted. These processes occur continuously, and they are largely automatic, but they are not infallible. Under certain conditions, the construction becomes visible. Optical illusions demonstrate this clearly. The same image can produce different perceptions depending on how it is interpreted. This shows that perception is not fixed. It is flexible, dependent on context, and dependent on expectation. Expectation plays a central role in shaping perception. Before input is fully processed, the brain predicts what is likely to be seen. This prediction influences interpretation. In some cases, it dominates it. The brain may prioritize expectation over incoming data, especially when the data is ambiguous. This is why familiar patterns are recognized quickly, but also why errors occur. Perception is not neutral. It is guided by prior experience, by learned associations, by context. This guidance allows efficiency, but reduces objectivity, which means what is experienced is always partially constructed. This becomes more apparent when attention is directed inward. When observation slows, it is possible to notice the transition from sensation to perception, from perception to recognition, from recognition to meaning. This transition is subtle, but it can be observed. A sound before it is identified, a shape before it is named, a sensation before it is categorized. In these moments, experience is simpler, less structured, less defined, not empty, but less interpreted. This is sometimes described as preconceptual awareness. Awareness before concepts are applied. It is not a separate state. It's a stage that is usually passed quickly because the mind moves rapidly toward meaning, toward recognition, toward interpretation. But when this movement slows, even slightly, the structure of experience becomes clearer. It is no longer taken for granted. It can be observed as it forms. And this observation reveals something important, that objects are not given. They are constructed. That meaning is not inherent. It is assigned. and that perception is not passive, it is active, continuously organizing input into a usable form. This does not make perception unreliable. It makes it functional, designed for interaction rather than exact representation. But it also means that what is experienced is always shaped by processes that operate beneath awareness. And when those processes are noticed, the relationship to perception changes. It becomes less rigid, less absolute, more open. Not because reality changes, but because the way it is interpreted becomes visible. This visibility creates space between sensation and meaning, between perception and interpretation. And in that space, there is less immediacy, less automatic identification, more direct observation, not of objects, but of the process that creates them. And as this continues, another question begins to form. If perception is constructed, if meaning is applied, if recognition is learned, then what is experience? Before all of that, what remains when labeling has not yet occurred? And how does awareness relate to this earlier stage? Because awareness is present throughout the entire sequence, before recognition, before naming, before interpretation. It does not begin with meaning. It is already there. And this suggests that awareness is not dependent on conceptual thought, not dependent on labeling, not dependent on interpretation, but present before all of them and continuing as they unfold. This observation does not remove meaning, but it places it within a larger structure, a structure that includes sensation, perception, recognition, interpretation, all occurring within awareness. And as this becomes clearer, attention naturally begins to shift again from the construction of experience toward what remains constant as that construction continues. Not what changes, but what does not. And that leads toward a deeper stillness, not empty, but less defined, where experience continues, but with less effort, less interpretation, less movement. And in that reduction, the next layer becomes visible, not as a concept, but as something that can be noticed directly. Up to this point, experience has been examined in layers: sensation, perception, recognition, interpretation. Each stage building on the one before it, each stage adding structure, and from that structure, the world appears. Objects form, meaning is assigned, identity is maintained, continuity is constructed. All of it arising from processes that operate continuously, often without being noticed, but now something else becomes possible, not another layer of explanation, but a shift in observation from what is appearing to what allows it to appear. Because throughout every stage, there has been something constant, not the content, not the thoughts, not the sensations, but the fact that they are known. This knowing does not require effort. It does not need to be created. It does not depend on any specific form of experience. It is present before a thought is noticed, before a sensation is interpreted, before a perception is recognized. It does not begin with the content. It is already there, and it remains as the content changes. This creates a distinction between perception and awareness. Perception involves input, processing, organization. It is dynamic. It changes continuously. It depends on conditions. Awareness does not follow the same pattern. It does not organize. It does not interpret. It does not construct. It simply is. This can be difficult to notice because perception is so active, so immediate, so continuous. It draws attention outward, toward objects, toward meaning, toward identification. But when attention relaxes, even slightly, the distinction becomes clearer. There is the sound, and there is the knowing of the sound. There is the thought, and there is the knowing of the thought. There is the sensation, and there is the knowing of the sensation. The sound changes. The thought changes. The sensation changes. but the knowing does not change in the same way. It does not take on the form of what it observes. It does not become the sound or the thought or the sensation. It remains unaltered by them. This is not an abstract idea. It can be observed directly, even now. As experience unfolds, there is something that is aware of it, not as a concept, but as a simple fact. And when attention rests there, even briefly, the structure of experience begins to shift, not in content, but in relationship. Thoughts may still arise, perception may still occur, but they are not as tightly held, not as immediately identified with. There is more space between what appears and the sense of being defined by it. This space is not created. It is revealed. It becomes noticeable when attention is not fully absorbed in content. At first, this may feel subtle, easy to overlook, because the habit of focusing on content is strong, built through repetition, reinforced through use. But with continued observation, the distinction becomes more stable. Awareness is seen as separate from what it contains, not separate in location, but separate in function. It does not participate. In the same way, it does not construct or interpret. It allows. And this changes the question from what is consciousness made of to what is the nature of awareness, independent of what appears within it. This question does not require analysis. It requires observation, because awareness is not hidden. It is present in every moment, but it is often overlooked, not because it is distant, but because attention is directed elsewhere, toward objects, toward meaning, toward narrative. And as attention softens, the need to follow those movements begins to decrease. Thoughts continue, but they are not pursued. Sensations arise, but they are not interpreted immediately. Perception unfolds, but without constant labeling. And in that reduction, experience becomes quieter, not empty, but less structured, less divided, more continuous. There is still sound, still sensation, still subtle movement, but less effort to organize it, less effort to define it, and within that, awareness becomes more apparent, not as something new, but as something that was always present, simply not emphasized. And as this continues, even the distinction between awareness and what appears within it begins to soften, not because they merge, but because the need to separate them becomes less important. Experience continues, but without the same level of division, without the same insistence on defining each part. There is less movement toward explanation, less need to resolve, less effort to understand completely, and more allowance for what is already present. This does not remove thought. It does not remove perception. It does not remove identity. But it changes their weight. They are no longer the center. They are part of a larger field, a field that remains even as they change. And as this becomes more familiar, the pace naturally slows, not forced, not controlled, but a reduction in momentum. Less need to move from one idea to the next, less need to follow each thought to its conclusion, more space between moments, more quiet between movements, and in that quiet, there is no urgency, no requirement to define awareness completely, no need to reach a final answer, because whatever awareness is, it is already present, already functioning, already allowing experience to occur without effort, without direction, without needing to be understood. And as this is noticed, even slightly, the question begins to soften, not disappear, but lose its urgency, lose its need to be resolved immediately. And what remains is not an answer, but a stillness, a quiet recognition that experience is unfolding on its own, that awareness is present without needing to be maintained, and that nothing needs to be added for this to be complete. So as the mind continues to settle even slightly, there is less to follow, less to analyze, less to construct, only the gentle movement of experience as it comes and goes. and the steady presence that remains throughout it all, unchanging, unforced, and quietly at rest. Conscious experience is not generated by a single location in the brain. It emerges from coordinated activity across multiple networks. One of the most studied is the default mode network. This network includes regions such as the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus. It becomes active when attention is not focused on an external task. During mind wandering, memory recall, imagining the future, thinking about the self, this network supports self-referential processing, the ability to construct a narrative about past, present, and future. When the default mode network is highly active, thought tends to move internally, often in the form of internal dialogue, memory replay, scenario simulation. This is sometimes experienced as thinking. A different network, known as the task positive network, becomes active during focused attention. This includes regions involved in sensory processing, decision-making, goal-directed behavior. When this network is active, attention is directed outward, toward objects, tasks, immediate input. These two networks often show an inverse relationship. When one increases in activity, the other decreases. This creates a shifting pattern between internal and external focus. This shift is continuous. Attention moves between networks based on context. Another key system is the salience network. It includes structures such as the anterior insula, the anterior cingulate cortex. Its function is to detect what is important. It evaluates incoming information and determines where attention should go. This network acts as a switch, directing activity toward internal thought or external input based on relevance. Together, these networks form a system that regulates awareness, not by creating it in one place, but by coordinating activity across regions Meta-awareness is another important feature of the mind. It refers to the ability to become aware of one's own thoughts. For example, a thought is occurring, and then there is recognition. I am thinking. This second layer is meta-awareness. It involves additional brain activity, particularly in frontal regions. This process allows monitoring of attention, regulation of behavior, interruption of automatic patterns. Without meta-awareness, thought can continue without being noticed. Attention can drift without recognition. This is often called mind wandering without awareness. Studies show that a significant portion of time is spent in this state. Thoughts occur, but are not observed as thoughts. They are experienced as reality. When meta-awareness increases, this changes. Thought is still present, but it is recognized. This recognition alters the experience. It creates a distinction between the content of thought and the observation of it. This distinction is measurable. Brain imaging shows different patterns of activation. When individuals are aware of their thoughts versus when they are not. Another measurable feature is attention stability. Attention is not constant. It fluctuates, even during focused tasks. Attention can shift multiple times per minute. These fluctuations are associated with changes in neural activity. Short lapses can occur without being noticed. This affects perception, reaction time, accuracy. Training attention can reduce these fluctuations, improving consistency and increasing awareness of shifts. Working memory also plays a role in conscious experience. It refers to the ability to hold and manipulate information over short periods. This capacity is limited. Typically, only a few elements can be maintained at once. This limitation shapes experience. It restricts how much information can be consciously processed, how complex a thought can be, how many variables can be considered simultaneously. Long-term memory operates differently. It stores information across distributed networks. Retrieval involves reconstruction rather than direct playback. This reconstruction is influenced by current context, emotional state, existing beliefs, which means memory is dynamic, not static. The sense of a continuous self relies on this system, linking past experiences to present awareness. But as shown earlier, this continuity can be disrupted when memory systems are impaired. The sense of identity changes, which indicates that identity depends on memory integration, conscious perception also requires integration. Information from different senses is combined. Visual input, auditory input, body signals, all aligned into a single experience. This integration occurs within a narrow time window, typically within milliseconds. If signals are delayed or desynchronized, perception changes. This demonstrates that conscious experience is constructed from multiple inputs combined in time. Another important factor is neural synchrony. Groups of neurons fire in coordinated patterns. This synchronization is associated with attention, perception, awareness. When synchrony increases, integration improves. Information is more effectively combined. Some theories suggest that this coordination is necessary for conscious experience, not sufficient on its own, but required for coherent awareness. Alterations in brain state also affect consciousness. During sleep, activity patterns change. In deep sleep, there is reduced integration, which correlates with reduced conscious experience. In dreaming, activity increases in certain regions, producing internal imagery without external input. In anesthesia, communication between regions decreases, which leads to loss of awareness. These changes demonstrate that consciousness depends on network activity, connectivity, coordination. But even with this knowledge, a key question remains. These mechanisms explain how information is processed, how attention is directed, how perception is integrated. But they do not fully explain why these processes are experienced, why there is an internal perspective, why there is something it feels like to be the system. This gap remains central, and it continues to guide research because understanding the structure is not the same as explaining experience. And while the brain can be mapped and its activity measured, the subjective aspect remains internal, accessible only from within. This is the current boundary, not of data, but of explanation. And as research continues, this boundary remains, not because nothing is known, but because the question itself extends beyond what can be directly observed. And so, the investigation continues, not only into how the mind works, but into what it means for experience to exist at all. A large portion of mental activity occurs outside of conscious awareness. This includes perception, emotional evaluation, decision preparation, motor planning. By the time a thought is noticed, much of the underlying processing has already occurred. This is especially clear in studies of decision making, in controlled experiments. Participants are asked to make simple choices. For example, pressing a button with the left or right hand, while their brain activity is recorded using techniques such as EEG, fMRI. Researchers have observed that neural signals associated with the decision appear before the participant reports deciding. In some cases, several hundred milliseconds earlier. This suggests that the brain begins preparing an action before conscious awareness of the decision. Conscious intention may follow rather than initiate. This does not mean that conscious thought has no role, but it indicates that it is not the starting point. It may act more as a monitor, an interpreter, or a regulator of processes already in motion. This pattern extends beyond simple actions. In more complex decisions, Unconscious processing continues to play a role. The brain evaluates probabilities, past outcomes, emotional significance, often before the reasoning is articulated. This is sometimes experienced as intuition, a rapid judgment without explicit reasoning. Studies show that intuitive decisions can be accurate, especially in familiar contexts where prior experience has shaped internal models. However, intuition is not always reliable. It is influenced by bias, incomplete information, emotional state, which means it can produce errors. Deliberate reasoning provides a different approach. It is slower, more structured, more resource intensive. It relies on working memory, attention, language to evaluate options. This system can override initial impulses, but it is limited. Working memory capacity restricts how many variables can be considered at once. Attention can fatigue, and reasoning can be influenced by prior belief. This creates a dual process system, sometimes described as fast, automatic processing, slow, deliberate processing. Both systems are necessary. Automatic processes handle routine tasks efficiently. Deliberate processes allow flexibility and correction. The balance between them shapes behavior. Control over behavior is therefore partial, not absolute. Actions emerge from automatic processes influenced by prior experience, modulated by conscious awareness. The sense of agency, the feeling of I am doing this, is constructed. It arises when intention, action, and outcome align in time. When these elements match, the brain attributes the action to the self. If they do not align, the sense of agency can weaken. This can be observed in certain conditions. For example, when movement is externally guided but appears self-generated, or when thoughts feel intrusive, not controlled. These experiences show that agency is not inherent to every action or thought. It depends on how events are integrated. Timing is critical. The brain uses temporal proximity to link cause and effect. If an action is followed quickly by an outcome, the connection is strengthened. If the delay increases, the connection weakens. This influences learning. Reinforcement is more effective when feedback is immediate because the brain can associate action with result. This mechanism underlies habit formation, skill acquisition, behavioral conditioning. Habits are formed through repetition. Neural pathways strengthen with consistent use. Over time, actions require less conscious input. They become automatic. This increases efficiency, but reduces flexibility. Changing a habit requires attention, repetition, and often effort to override established pathways. Emotional systems also influence decisions. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex integrates emotional information with decision making. Damage to this region can impair judgment, even when logical reasoning remains intact. This demonstrates that emotion is not separate from decision making. It is integrated into it, providing signals about value, risk, relevance. Without these signals, decision making becomes inefficient or inconsistent. Another factor is reward processing. The brain uses neurotransmitters such as dopamine to signal reward prediction. When outcomes match expectation, dopamine activity stabilizes. When outcomes exceed expectation, activity increases. When outcomes fall short, activity decreases. This signal updates behavior, encouraging actions that lead to positive outcomes and discouraging those that do not. Over time, this shapes learning and influences decision patterns, but it can also contribute to maladaptive behavior when reward systems are overstimulated or misaligned. This can lead to impulsivity, addiction, compulsive behavior, because the system prioritizes immediate reward over long-term outcome. Attention interacts with these systems. where attention is directed, influences which options are considered, which outcomes are evaluated, and which actions are taken. This makes attention a key point of control, even if not absolute. By shifting attention, the range of possible actions changes, which affects decision making. This is one reason why training attention can alter behavior, not by changing underlying systems directly, but by influencing how they are used. Despite all of this complexity, the experience of decision making often feels simple. A thought appears, a choice is made, an action follows. But beneath that simplicity is a layered process involving prediction, evaluation, memory, emotion, attention, all interacting before awareness recognizes the result. This layered structure challenges the idea of a fully independent decision maker because actions are not generated from a single point. They emerge from distributed processes, and awareness registers them, interprets them, and integrates them into the narrative of the self. This does not eliminate responsibility, but it reframes it from complete control to partial influence, from isolated decision to emergent behavior. And as this becomes clearer, another question arises. If thoughts can arise without intention, if decisions begin before awareness, if actions emerge from distributed systems, then what is the role of conscious awareness? Is it directing or observing, modifying or interpreting, or something else entirely? This question leads forward, not into abstraction, but into measurable differences between conscious and unconscious processing, and into how awareness interacts with the systems that generate behavior at any given moment. The brain processes more information than reaches conscious awareness. Sensory systems continuously receive input, visual signals, auditory signals, internal body signals, all active, all being processed, but only a portion becomes conscious This threshold is not fixed. It changes based on attention, relevance, emotional significance, expectation, stimuli that are strong or unexpected are more likely to reach awareness, but strength alone is not enough. Attention is required. Without attention, information can be processed without being experienced. This is demonstrated in experiments involving masked stimuli. Images are presented too briefly to be consciously recognized, and yet they influence behavior. Participants may respond differently to words or images. They do not report seeing. This shows that processing occurs without awareness. Another example is blind sight. Individuals with damage to the visual cortex report no conscious vision, and yet they can respond to visual stimuli. They can detect movement or identify location without experiencing sight. This indicates that perception and awareness are not identical. Perception can occur without conscious experience. Awareness requires additional integration. This integration involves coordination across networks. When activity is fragmented, experience does not emerge. When activity becomes coordinated, information enters awareness. This coordination is limited. Only a small amount of information can be integrated at once, which is why awareness feels focused, centered on a narrow range of content, while most processing remains outside of it. This creates a layered system. At one level, continuous processing. At another, selective awareness. And at the interface, a threshold where some information becomes experience and most does not. This threshold is not fully understood, but it is measurable. Changes in attention alter what crosses it. Changes in brain state alter its sensitivity. Fatigue, stress, emotion, all influence what is noticed and what is not. This means conscious experience is not a complete picture. It is a selection, a small portion of a much larger system, and yet it feels complete because the mind fills in gaps, constructs continuity, maintains coherence, even when information is missing. This creates a stable experience, but not a complete one. And as this becomes clearer, the sense of certainty begins to soften, not because experience disappears, but because its limits become visible. The mind continues to process, continues to interpret, continues to construct, but it is no longer assumed to capture everything. And with that, there is less need to hold each perception as final, less need to resolve every thought, less urgency to define experience completely, because what is present is only part of what is occurring. And what is occurring is already unfolding without needing to be controlled. The systems continue. Perception forms. Thought arises. Attention shifts. Decisions emerge. All within a structure that operates continuously. And awareness remains present as part of that structure, not separate from it, but not identical to any single part. It does not need to track everything. It does not need to understand everything. It simply registers what comes into focus and allows the rest to remain in the background. As this continues, the movement of thought begins to slow, not stopped, but less insistent, less demanding. There is still activity, still perception, still subtle shifts in attention, but they are lighter, less fixed, more transient, appearing and passing without needing to be held. And in that, there is less effort, less need to follow each change, less need to maintain a position, only the steady flow of experience as it unfolds without requiring completion, without requiring resolution. And as the mind settles, even slightly, there is less to track, less to organize, less to interpret. The systems continue, but attention softens. And within that softening, there is no clear boundary between one moment and the next. only a gradual transition, a continuous unfolding, without sharp edges, without fixed points, and nothing needs to be added. To make this complete, because whatever awareness is, it is already present, already functioning, without effort, and already sufficient for experience to occur. So there is no need to reach a final conclusion, no need to define it completely, only to notice that it is here. And as everything continues, there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to maintain, nothing to resolve, only the quiet continuation of what is already happening, moment by moment, unfolding and gradually settling into stillness,